I'm Greg Ashman, and I'm a teacher. And I'm very honoured to be here amongst such famous company. I'm going to be talking about education and the individual, and the relationship between a teacher and the class, and a teacher and the individuals within that class. To start off, I would like you to read two quotes from John Dewey. I've selected those two quotes quite purposefully. The first one talks about self-realization. It's a key focus on the individual student. The second quote talks about the participation of the learner in the formation of the purposes which direct his activities. Again, it's about the individual. I've chosen two quotes from Dewey that are separated by over 30 years, because whenever I talk about John Dewey, I get told two things. One, that I have misunderstood him, and two, that his views changed over time. So I've selected these two quotes from two different times in his career to show that the focus on the individual was a key part of his philosophy. Now, I hope that you are familiar with the fact that John Dewey and his thinking sits behind a lot of the educational thinking that is current in university departments of education and the faculties of education that train teachers, certainly in the US, the UK and Australia, and I'm led to believe in the Netherlands as well. One point I would like to make is that John Dewey is a key figure in the tradition, I'm going to call it, which is a slightly odd thing to call it, the tradition of educational progressivism. He's a key figure in that tradition. And the second point I would like to make is that a focus on individualism is not necessarily a particularly politically left-wing or politically progressive position. I want to break down this very close identification between politics and particular teaching practices. And I think that this is one area where that's particularly justified. Left-wing politics tend to emphasize collectivism and collective action, and not the individual. The individual tends to be more associated with, consumerism. So there's my photograph of a supermarket there with all the cans of beans or whatever they are categorized, and the individual goes into the supermarket and selects the thing that's appropriate to them. That is more associated with capitalism and right-wing market-orientated thinking. So I just want to disrupt that idea that focusing on individuality is necessarily associated with the political left, because I don't think that they've got much to do with each other at all. Here's two buzzwords that you will see in education. Everywhere I go, people are talking about these two words. They're talking about differentiation, and they're talking about personalized learning. And both of these approaches are aimed at directing activities, work, learning to the specific needs of the individual. Here is a definition of differentiation from Carol Ann Tomlinson. There we go. Who is a world expert, a recognized expert in differentiation. I'll give you a moment to read that. So differentiation is the process of tailoring instruction to individual needs. Here is a definition of personalized learning, and I will give you a moment to read this. So that's from the US Department of Education, and that's a definition of personalized learning. The key difference seems to be in these definitions when you look at a few of them, that personalized learning tends to emphasize the role of computers and information technology in individualizing the teaching. Here's the next statement that I'm going to make. I've looked. I have. I've looked in a lot of places, and I haven't found much positive evidence to support the use of differentiation. I'm going to give you some rough analyses first, and then I'm going to get a little bit more specific. This data, there we go. This data is from the PISA program run by the OECD. And this is from a survey of teachers. Okay, so they asked teachers how often, oh, I can't read that one, how often they give different work to the students who have difficulties learning and or to those who can advance faster. Now, this is not definitive proof of anything, it's a correlation. But isn't it funny that the more the teachers do this, the lower the achievement in PISA maths appears to be. If differentiation, if giving different work to different individuals based on your perception of their needs was a highly effective teaching strategy, you'd at least expect the line to not go that way. You might expect it to go the other way. This is the PISA definition of what a student-oriented classroom climate looks like. Okay, so PISA identifies 3 dimensions of good teaching, and one of those is a student-oriented classroom climate. The level of this student-oriented classroom climate is determined by asking students who are participating in PISA a series of survey questions. These are the questions that PISA have associated with a student-oriented classroom climate. So you'll be familiar with the first one from the graph I've just shown you. Assigning projects, they think, is associated with a student-oriented classroom climate. Using small groups to come up with solutions for themselves, rather than just teaching the class, getting small groups to work on problems. And the teacher asking the students to help plan classroom activities. Again, this is a very rough analysis, but the association here is quite striking. So, on the graph on the left, basically what you're seeing is that the greater the amount of use of student-orientated classroom activities as reported by the students, the lower the PISA maths score in 2012, that is. On the other hand, the graph on the right shows the percentage of low performers versus the average percent for student orientation activities. So that's showing that the more student orientation you have, the greater the number of lower performers. Now, of course, these are correlations, and correlations are not necessarily causes. So it could be that something is prompting teachers who have a larger number of students who are struggling to use these student-orientated activities. That would be one way of explaining such a correlation. Alternatively, it could be a cause, and it could be that the greater the use of these student-orientated activities, the worse the impact on students' learning. Given that differentiation sits at the heart of these student-orientated activities, student choice, tailoring the work to the individual needs of the students, this is not positive evidence for differentiation. A more sophisticated analysis has been done than the one I've just shown you that I managed to do just based on the published PISA data. And this was done by a set of academics. And they actually found some, rather than looking at different countries and just plotting the different countries, they looked within each country's data. So they looked at the data within each country. And they found that in every education system that participated in this study, the use of student-orientated instruction was negatively related to maths performance in every system. None of those 4 components of the scale were positively related to mathematics performance. Now, you might be saying, okay, that's all very well, but all you've talked about so far is PISA maths. And there are other subjects and there are other sources of evidence. So let's have a look at them. Caroline Tomlinson, who I mentioned earlier, the world expert in differentiated instruction, ran a study in the United States. And I think it was 3 different jurisdictions that the study ran in across a large number of schools. And she was involved in helping deliver the training for teachers on differentiated instruction along with a large team. This is the kind of study that we would expect to generate a positive result. In education, it's actually usually quite easy to generate a positive result because you get people enthusiastic about your new idea, you get them excited about your new idea, and that in itself can have an impact on the learning of the students. Particularly if the originators of this idea are involved in running the study. So one of the things that is a bit more of a gold standard in education research is when you take those packages of ideas and then you get other people to try and implement them away from the original developers. So you might expect a positive result, but there wasn't one. The use of training in these differentiated instruction strategies didn't lead to any gains in student learning. And interestingly, you have to read quite a long way through the report to get to those findings. They're not necessarily headlined at the start of the report. But what is written about a lot in the report is the fact that the teachers let the researchers down because the teachers didn't implement these differentiated instruction strategies properly. Naughty teachers. Now, you can think of this 2 ways. There are 2 possibilities that spring to mind. Either differentiation doesn't work, so getting people to differentiate their instruction doesn't work, or it does work, but it's very, very hard to do, okay? Neither of those possibilities is encouraging for the use of differentiation. It either doesn't work in theory or it doesn't work in practice. Another popular approach to differentiation is known as universal design for learning. There's a website. The website for universal design for learning is particularly impressive because it has pictures of brains on it. And it's always very impressive with pictures of brains. And a review was done of various interventions based on universal design for learning, a very sympathetic review by people who were inclined to accept the need for this approach. And even they had to say the effect on educational outcomes has not been demonstrated. Another study, primary maths professional development. So primary maths teachers were given professional development, and there was a small effect initially, but that disappeared for the second cohort of teachers who are trained, which is highly indicative, again, of this effect of something new and people being enthusiastic about it, and then that gradually fading away over time. I have found one positive study on differentiation. And you can tell it's positive because I put a smiley face there. Where is it? There it is, smiley face. This was an effective differentiation strategy, and it was in middle school. Wait a bit, I've been told not to say middle school. It was in secondary school science, okay? So secondary school science. And this was billed as a differentiation strategy, and it did work. The study shows that it worked. However, it's a funny study because the students, all the tasks are assigned by the teachers, which is fine, that is a form of differentiation, but differentiation often does stress student choice. But the teachers are all in charge here, they're all in control, they're deciding who gets what task. The comparison condition, the students that they were being compared with were a group of students who were given worksheets to complete. Now, I'm not convinced that's the strongest comparison condition to compare with, because as an experienced teacher, I know what often happens when you give students worksheets to complete. Students who required assistance in the differentiation condition were paired, interestingly, with higher achieving partners, and the partner was tasked with helping the struggling student improve. And I think that's interesting. So this is an example of an effective differentiation intervention, but I wouldn't say it's typical of how differentiation often gets enacted in the classroom. So then we go on to personalized learning. Now, personalized learning is a newer idea. It's really developed in parallel with the development of the personal computer. And because it's newer, there's less evidence about. There are some mixed results. You do see some positive evidence, but usually it's maths. So usually it's some sort of adaptive maths tutoring package and a specific piece of software. A couple of reviews have been done. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation found some positive evidence for schools adopting personalized learning compared with a control group. But again, with all this research, we have to think about what the control group is. That's just schools carrying on, not being given computers and just doing what they would normally do. A randomized trial of School of One, a maths intervention, so that's a more high-quality sort of study, found mixed evidence. So there's no overwhelming evidence, there's no compelling evidence here for personalized learning, just as there's no overwhelming, compelling evidence for the use of differentiation. The other thing about personalized learning is, I don't know about you, but the idea of students sitting in front of computers all day, not interacting with teachers, I'm not sure that that's the kind of education system that I want to be working in. And there's a number of articles that you can find online. One by a guy who worked in one of these personalized learning schools in the US, who was a passionate supporter of the idea, and then he went to work in one of these schools, and gradually he became very disillusioned with the whole thing. Basically because you plonked kids in front of computers, and it didn't feel like a proper education to him. Now, I think a key question, if you try and look for this evidence, a key question that you have to ask yourself is, are differentiation and personalization actually useful terms? Are they meaningful? We've already seen that you can get all sorts of different things badged as differentiation. So, and one of the problems for me is that the term differentiation doesn't differentiate, ironically, between two opposing ideas. So you've got a student in your class who is struggling with writing, and you decide to differentiate to meet their needs. What do? Do Do you accommodate those needs? Do you say, well, you struggle with writing, so instead of writing, you can make a poster, or you can perform a role play? That's differentiation, right? Or do you address that student's needs? Do you say, you're struggling with writing, so we're going to give you intensive support with your writing. We're going to take you out of class and maybe give you an intensive writing intervention, or we're going to give you a scaffold in class to help you write. That's differentiation, isn't it? Both of these things are differentiation, but they're the complete opposites of each other. So what is the use of a term that can stand for opposite things? What works better? Well, as I said, I've gone on a bit of a hunt. I haven't done what we call a systematic review, but I have done my best to look at the evidence of differentiation personalized learning, and I've struggled to find much evidence. Yet there are classroom teaching approaches for which there is a wealth of evidence, which is easy to find. And it's odd that we should focus on differentiation, that differentiation should be a buzzword, when these other approaches to teaching and learning have a lot more evidence behind them. So here's a couple of things from PISA, going back to the PISA 2012 data, because they asked a lot of useful questions that you can look for correlations. Teacher-directed instruction was associated with higher maths scores, up to a point, after which if you had more teacher-directed instructions, they started to tail off again. Strategies described as cognitive activation tended to be associated with higher scores. You might wonder what cognitive activation is, because PISA comes up with strange terms for some of these things. So these are the sorts of things that PISA describes as cognitive activation. Now, a couple of themes arise from that for me. One is that it involves a lot of assessment. It involves the teacher asking a lot of questions, and it involves the comparison of different types of solution methods and different types of approaches. So that's something that we ought to be aware of. Going back to this idea of teacher-directed instruction, something else I'd like to mention is whole class explicit instruction, or explicit teaching. Now, we have to be careful what we mean by this. And so, in order to be careful about what I mean by this, I have made a diagram. There we go. So, at the center of this diagram, in the smallest oval shape there, is a set of approaches called direct instruction, which I've given a capital D and a capital I. And that refers to the kinds of scripted approaches developed by Zig Engelman and his colleagues in the United States at the University of Oregon, where everything the teacher does is essentially written out, and the teacher has to follow that plan. I think that that is a subset, a subgroup of explicit instruction more generally. But I would not include in explicit instruction things like lecturing or default, any old approach where a teacher just talks to the students from the front of the class. And I want to clarify what I mean by this, okay? So direct instruction, which is a phrase that a lot of people use, can mean all sorts of different things to different people. So I want to be very clear what I mean by this, and what I mean by explicit instruction. Unfortunately, there's a guy called Barak Rosenshine in the US who's written a paper that makes it very, very clear what we mean by this kind of instruction. It's called Principles of Instruction, and it's freely available online. You can Google it. It's been published in American Educator magazine, which publishes a range of great articles, including some by Don Hirsch. So it's well worth looking at. And I want you to notice some of the features of this kind of explicit teaching as described by Barak Rosenshine. The idea of a review of previous learning, presenting new material in small steps, asking a large number of questions and checking the responses of all students, providing models, guiding student practice, checking for student understanding, providing scaffolds for difficult tasks, requiring and monitoring independent practice. Now, this is a very important point. Some people, explicit teaching to some people just means the moment in a classroom when the teacher stands at the front and talks. That's not what this kind of explicit teaching is. This kind of explicit teaching is a whole system. It probably starts with the teacher talking, but it goes through guiding the practice to eventually the student working independently. So you could go into a classroom where students are working independently. That classroom could be employing explicit teaching, but we're just at that stage. It follows the I do, we do, now you do model of teaching. It's a whole system. And the reason I stress these features are because this form of explicit teaching came from a range of research conducted around the 1960s into the 1970s, called product process research. What researchers did is they went into various classrooms of different teachers. They looked at what those teachers did in the classroom. They had various different approaches to coding those teacher behaviors. Then they looked at the gains in student test scores of the students in the different classes, and they looked to see if some of those behaviors that they coded were correlated with better performance of the teachers. And they were. And it's those behaviors that make up Barak Rosenshine's model of explicit teaching. Those are the kinds of behaviors that were correlated with greater student gains. Again, it's a correlation, but later on people have attempted to teach these strategies to teachers. The teachers have then tried to employ them in the classroom, and we have seen evidence that their students also improved. Project follow-through isn't quite product process research. It's worth mentioning because it is the biggest educational experiment of all time. And it broadly, I'm not going to go into details of this. It was a messy experiment, and some people dismiss it because it was messy. But it broadly substantiated these findings. And helpfully, a couple of researchers, Daniel Mausch and David Reynolds, have summarized the study from other parts of the research from other parts of the world, which again confirms that these practices are associated with greater student gains. This is an interesting one, given that Don Hirsch is here, but similarly, although and I accept the idea that teaching reading comprehension strategies has only a limited boost to students' reading ability. If you are going to teach reading comprehension strategies, the evidence suggests that using explicit instruction is the most effective way to teach them. And then I've got a range of other evidence that, again, I believe supports this idea of explicit teaching. So we've got a range of studies. An interesting one conducted in the Netherlands, which encapsulates some of this, was a maths study where students who had difficulties with maths were given either a constructivist intervention, maths intervention, constructivist, so students had to come up with their own methods, their methods were shared and there was a discussion around it. Another group of students were given an explicit teaching intervention, and a third group of students were given no intervention at all. What's interesting is both the interventions improved the students' maths ability. So if you'd run just two conditions, you'd have seen that both of them were effective. But the explicit teaching intervention was more effective than the constructivist one with these students. So they were both effective, they were both better than doing nothing, And most educational research essentially compares doing something with doing nothing. And doing something is usually better than doing nothing. But in this case, the explicit teaching approach was better than the constructivist one. And I'll probably finish with a little bit discussion about this and then why we might do this. So my research that I'm doing as part of my PhD is in a field called cognitive load theory, developed by my PhD supervisor, John Sweller, and others. And there's a lot to cognitive load theory. If you go on my blog, I recently published a blog post with lots of resources on cognitive load theory, explaining cognitive load theory and the different implications. But the central idea of cognitive load theory is actually well accepted across the board in psychology, even to people that don't subscribe to cognitive load theory itself. This is the idea that we can model the mind as consisting of an extremely constrained working memory and an effectively limitless long-term memory. And we have to operate within the constraints of the working memory. And we can very easily overload working memory, particularly when we're teaching things that are complex, like maths or writing. We can easily overload working memory. And when we do, that leads to very little learning and quite a lot of frustration. By breaking things down into small chunks, in the way that explicit teaching encourages teachers to do, we can make sure that we're not overloading working memory, and we can make sure that learning passes into long-term memory. So that's a very, very potted summary, but there are lots of cognitive load theory effects, lots of ways that you can try and adapt your instruction, your teaching, to take account of those effects. So, finally, why are we trying to differentiate and personalize everything? So here's a quote from Daniel Willingham, which I'll give you time to read. Perhaps we made a mistake. Perhaps it was a little bit misguided to focus on the differences between students. Perhaps what they have in common is actually, in terms of our teaching, more important than what separates them from each other. And perhaps that is why whole class interactive teaching, where we're not making predictions about what students can do, predictions that could be wrong, we're exposing all students to the same content in a collective effort, is more successful. Thank you.